The waters of the Bismarck Sea stretched endlessly beneath a sky that promised nothing but tranquility on that fateful morning in the early days of March 1943. 8 massive transport vessels cut through the gentle waves, their hulls laden with thousands of Japanese soldiers, equipment, ammunition, and the hopes of an empire that still believed itself invincible. Surrounding these transports like vigilant shepherds were destroyers, their decks bristling with anti-aircraft guns, their crews confident in there to repel any threat that might emerge from the heavens above. Standing on the command bridge of the transport ship Kios Maru, Colonel Tishi Nakamura allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he surveyed the convoy. The crossing had proceeded smoothly thus far, and the destination of Leh in New Guinea seemed well within reach. The soldiers packed below decks represented a crucial reinforcement for Japanese forces struggling to maintain their grip on the contested island. These men would tip the balance, or so the colonel believed. The morning air was crisp, the sea calm, and every indication suggested that this would be just another successful transit across waters the Japanese had come to regard as their own. But far from the convoy, beyond the horizon where the curvature of the earth hid one force from another, a different kind of preparation was reaching its crescendo. On dusty airfields scattered across the northern coast of Australia and southern New Guinea, American airmen were making final preparations for a mission that would challenge every established principle of aerial warfare. The sounds of aircraft engines being tested filled the air, mixing with the metallic clink of ammunition belts being loaded and the urgent voices of mechanics making last-minute adjustments to machines that had been transformed into something unprecedented in the history of military aviation. The story of what was about to unfold over the Bismarck Sea had its roots in months of frustration, innovation born from desperation, and the willingness of a few determined men to throw away the rulebook and write entirely new chapters in the manual of war. To understand the catastrophe that was about to befall Colonel Nakamura and his convoy, one must first understand how the Pacific War had evolved to this point, and why conventional methods of attacking enemy shipping had proven so utterly inadequate that radical innovation became not just desirable, but absolutely necessary for survival. By the time the calendar had turned to 1943, the Pacific theatre had become a vast chessboard where islands served as strategic squares and the ocean itself represented both highway and barrier. The Empire of Japan had expanded with stunning rapidity following the attack on Pearl Harbor, seizing territory across Southeast Asia, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and pushing deep into the Pacific island chains. This sprawling empire required constant supply and reinforcement, and the Japanese military had developed an intricate system of convoy routes that crisscrossed the ocean, carrying troops, weapons, food, fuel, and all the materiel necessary to sustain forces thousands of miles from the home islands. These convoys moved with a confidence born from the belief that well-armed destroyer escorts could protect their charges from any aerial threat. Japanese naval doctrine, heavily influenced by the theories of American strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan and refined through decades of study, held that concentrated firepower from surface vessels could repel aircraft attempting to strike at sea. The anti-aircraft batteries mounted on destroyers and even on the transport ships themselves were formidable, and Japanese crews had trained extensively in their use. When American aircraft had attempted to attack convoys in the early months of the war, the results had been discouraging to the point of despair. The problem facing Allied air forces was both simple and seemingly insurmountable. Traditional bombing doctrine called for aircraft to attack from high altitude, typically 20,000 feet or more. From such heights, bombardiers could theoretically calculate trajectories, account for wind and weather, and release their weapons with mathematical precision. The famous Norden bomb sight, installed in American bombers and treated as one of the military's most closely guarded secrets, was supposed to make bombing an exact science. Against stationary targets, against factories and cities and rail yards, this approach worked reasonably well. But against ships maneuvering at sea, it was virtually useless. A vessel travelling at 20 knots could cover hundreds of feet in the time it took a bomb to fall from high altitude. Ship captains who spotted incoming bombers overhead had only to order evasive maneuvers, turning the ship in unpredictable patterns, and the bombs that moments before had seemed certain to strike would instead splash harmlessly into empty ocean. Mission after mission returned to base with nothing to show for their efforts except expended fuel and frustrated crews. Pilots and bombardiers watched helplessly as their attacks accomplished nothing, while the enemy convoys sailed on unmolested, delivering their precious cargoes to reinforce positions that were making life hell for Allied ground forces. For General Douglas MacArthur's forces clinging to footholds in New Guinea, the situation was becoming critical. Every Japanese convoy that successfully reached its destination meant more enemy troops to fight, more bullets to dodge, more artillery to endure. The jungles of New Guinea were already a nightmare of disease, harsh terrain, and brutal combat. Without a way to interdict enemy supply lines, the campaign threatened to become a war of attrition that the Allies could not afford. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, who had assumed command of the United States 5th Air Force, found himself confronting this challenge day after day. Kenney was an officer who understood that warfare demanded flexibility and innovation. He had no patience for doctrine that demonstrably failed to achieve results. If high-altitude bombing could not hit moving ships, then some other method would have to be devised. The question was what that method might be, and whether it could be implemented before the next Japanese convoy delivered another load of reinforcements to extend the agony in New Guinea. The answer would come not from established military procedures or official channels, but from the workshops and imagination of men who were willing to look at the tools they had been given and ask how those tools might be transformed into something entirely different. One such man was Paul Irvin Gunn, universally known as Pappy, a figure who embodied the unconventional spirit that would ultimately reshape aerial warfare in the Pacific. Gunn's background was unlike that of most Army Air Forces officers. He had served in the Navy before civilian life, working in the Philippines where he had built a life for his family. When the Japanese invasion swept across the islands, Gunn's wife and children had been trapped, eventually ending up in internment camps. The personal tragedy fueled something fierce and relentless in Gunn's character. He channeled his rage and grief into a singular obsession with finding ways to kill Japanese forces more effectively. Looking at the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, Gunn saw not what it was, but what it could become. The B-25 had entered service as a conventional medium bomber designed to carry bombs internally and release them from altitude. Its nose section was constructed of transparent material, forming a greenhouse-like compartment where a bombardier would lie prone, peering through the Norden bomb site to guide the aircraft on its bombing run. This configuration made perfect sense for the missions the aircraft had originally been designed to perform. But Pappy Gunn looked at that glass nose and saw wasted space, a fragile bubble that served no useful purpose in the kind of warfare he envisioned. What if, he wondered, that entire nose section were replaced with something solid? What if instead of a bombardier's station, the front of the aircraft bristled with machine guns? Not just one or two defensive weapons, but a battery of heavy machine guns, all firing forward, all concentrated on a single target. The idea was radical to the point of heresy. Bombers were supposed to drop bombs, not engage in direct combat like fighters. But Gunn was not interested in supposed. He was interested in results. Working with Jack Fox, a representative from North American aviation, who was equally willing to think outside the boundaries of conventional design, Gunn began the process of transforming B-25 Mitchells into something unprecedented. In makeshift workshops using whatever materials could be scavenged or improvised, they stripped out the bombardier's compartment entirely. In its place, they installed a solid metal nose section reinforced to handle the stress of multiple weapons. They mounted machine guns, Browning M250 caliber weapons that had proven themselves as reliable and devastating in various roles. Initially, they installed 4 guns in the nose, then 6. Eventually, the most heavily armed variants would carry 8 forward-firing machine guns, creating a concentration of firepower that was staggering to contemplate. Each 50-caliber machine gun fired rounds that weighed approximately 4 ounces and travelled at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The bullets could punch through aircraft aluminum like paper and do serious damage even to heavier structures. A single gun could fire roughly 800 rounds per minute. 8 guns firing simultaneously meant more than 6,000 rounds per minute pouring from the nose of a single aircraft, a storm of lead and steel that could shred anything in its path. But devastating firepower alone was not sufficient to solve the problem of attacking ships at sea. The guns would be useless if the aircraft could not get close enough to use them effectively, and Japanese destroyer escorts were specifically designed to prevent exactly that. Their anti-aircraft batteries were formidable, and their crews were well trained. An aircraft attempting to approach a convoy would face a gauntlet of fire that could swat planes from the sky well before they entered effective gun range. This is where another innovation, developed in parallel with guns' work on armament, would prove equally crucial. Major William Benn, commanding officer of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron, had been grappling with the accuracy problem from a different angle. He had watched bomb after bomb fall uselessly into the ocean and began to think about alternatives to traditional level bombing from altitude. The idea that eventually crystallized in his mind was deceptively simple, almost childlike in its logic, yet fiendishly difficult to execute. What if bombs were released not from thousands of feet above the target, but from wave-top height? What if the bombs were literally skipped across the surface of the water like stones thrown across a pond, bouncing once or twice before slamming into the side of a ship right at the waterline where the hull was most vulnerable? Skip bombing, as this technique came to be known, offered several theoretical advantages. First, it eliminated the long fall time during which a ship could maneuver away from the bomb's trajectory. Second, it allowed for direct visual aiming rather than reliance on complex bomb sights and calculations. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it struck ships at their most vulnerable point. Naval architects designed vessels with heavy armour on decks to resist bombs falling from above, and with armour belts at the waterline to resist shells fired from other ships. But the area just above and below the waterline was relatively thin, and a bomb detonating there could rip open the hull, allowing water to flood into the ship with catastrophic results. The theory was elegant. The practice was terrifying. To execute a skip bombing attack, pilots would have to bring their aircraft down to altitudes of 200 feet or less, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the waves. They would have to accelerate to maximum speed, often exceeding 300 miles per hour, and fly straight toward their target while every gun on every ship in the convoy blazed away at them. They would have to hold their course, steady and true, until reaching the optimal release point, typically somewhere between 300 and 500 yards from the target. Only then could they release their bombs, pull up to avoid collision, and hope that their aircraft had not been shot to pieces in the approach. The training for this kind of attack was grueling and dangerous. Crews practiced over and over again, attacking hulks anchored in harbours, refining their timing, learning to judge distances and speeds by instinct rather than instruments. They learned to coordinate attacks so that multiple aircraft would strike a single target in rapid succession, with the first plane's gunfire suppressing defensive positions just long enough for the following aircraft to make their bombing runs. They learned to fly so low that spray from the waves would sometimes coat their windscreens, so close to the water that the slightest error in control could send them cartwheeling into the sea. The casualty rate during training was not insignificant, but those who mastered the technique emerged with skills that would prove devastating when employed against actual targets. As 1943 dawned, the various threads of innovation began to come together into a coherent doctrine. Pappy Gunn's 8-gun nose Mitchells, Bill Benn's skip bombing techniques, the gradual refinement of tactics through hard-won experience, all combined to create something genuinely new in military aviation. These modified B-25s were no longer medium bombers in any conventional sense. They had become what some crews began calling them, flying destroyers, aircraft that could engage surface vessels with a combination of gunfire and precisely delivered bombs in a manner that no ship captain had ever had to defend against. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware that such a threat existed. Their intelligence reports spoke of clumsy American bombing attempts that achieved little. Their confidence in the ability of destroyer escorts to protect convoys remained unshaken. As plans were laid for a major reinforcement convoy to cross the Bismarck Sea and deliver thousands of troops to Leh, Japanese commanders saw no reason for concern beyond the usual vigilance that any such operation required. The stage was set. The weapons had been forged. The crews had been trained. All that remained was for the target and the attackers to converge at the right moment. That moment would come in the first days of March 1943, and when it did, the nature of naval warfare would change forever. The Japanese convoy that departed Rabaul on the 1st of March represented a significant commitment of resources and manpower. The 8 transport ships carried not only approximately 7,000 combat troops, but also equipment, ammunition, medical supplies, and everything else necessary to sustain those forces once they reached their destination. The troop complement included veteran units that had seen action in earlier campaigns, fresh conscripts who had yet to experience battle, officers who carried detailed operational plans, and specialists of every description. In the holds of the transports, vehicles were lashed down, artillery pieces were secured, crates were stacked to the ceiling. This convoy was meant to decisively strengthen Japanese positions in New Guinea and provide the muscle needed to push Allied forces back toward Australia. The escort consisted of 8 destroyers, modern warships armed with the latest anti-aircraft weapons and crewed by sailors who had trained extensively in convoy defence. The destroyer captains positioned their vessels in a protective screen around the transports, overlapping their fields of fire so that any aircraft attempting to attack would face defensive fire from multiple ships simultaneously. Standard doctrine called for concentrated fire against incoming aircraft, with the goal of either shooting them down outright or forcing them to break off their attacks before reaching effective weapon range. This approach had worked well enough against the high-altitude bombing attempts that had characterized American attacks up to this point, and there was every reason to believe it would continue to work. For the first days of the voyage, weather provided an additional layer of protection. Heavy cloud cover and occasional storms obscured the convoy from aerial observation, allowing the ships to make steady progress southward through the Solomon Sea toward the Huon Gulf. The troops below decks endured the discomfort of being packed into confined spaces, the smell of too many men in too little room, the sounds of engines and waves, and the uncertainty that comes with knowing you are travelling toward war. Officers tried to maintain morale, leading group exercises when space permitted, distributing what extra rations were available, speaking confidently about the mission ahead. Colonel Nakamura, as senior army officer aboard the Kios Maru, made a point of visiting different sections of the ship, showing himself to the men, projecting an air of calm assurance. He had served in China and Manchuria, had seen combat before, and he knew that confidence from leadership could make the difference between troops who fought well and troops who broke under pressure. On the destroyers, life proceeded according to the rigid schedules that governed naval existence. Watches changed every 4 hours. Lookouts scanned the horizon constantly. Radar operators stared at their screens, searching for the telltale blips that would indicate approaching aircraft. Gun crews stood by their weapons, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The crews were professional, experienced, and confident in their training and equipment. They had escorted convoys before. They would escort convoys again. This was routine, even if the stakes were high. As the convoy approached the Vitiaz Strait between New Britain and New Guinea, the weather began to clear. The heavy clouds that had provided concealment started to break apart, revealing patches of blue sky. For the troops and sailors, better weather was a relief, a chance to get fresh air and see sunlight. For the convoy commanders, the clearing skies brought a different emotion, a wariness about increased visibility. Still, they were close to their destination now. Another day, perhaps 2, and the transports would reach Leh, unload their precious cargoes, and the mission would be complete. But Allied reconnaissance aircraft had been searching for this convoy with diligent persistence. Intelligence reports had suggested that a major Japanese movement was in the works, and patrol planes had been ranging far and wide across the Solomon Sea and Bismarck Sea, probing through breaks in the weather, following up on any hint or rumour. When the clouds finally parted enough to allow clear observation, sharp-eyed observers spotted the unmistakable pattern of a large convoy steaming southward. Contact reports were radioed back to headquarters, positions were plotted on maps, and suddenly the pieces of information that had been accumulating over previous days snapped into focus. Here was the target that 5th Air Force had been preparing to strike. Here was the opportunity to put all of the training, all of the modifications, all of the new tactics to the ultimate test under combat conditions. At Allied airfields across New Guinea, the reaction to the sighting reports was immediate and intense. Ground crews who had been working on aircraft with methodical routine suddenly found themselves racing against time. Bombs needed to be loaded, not just any bombs, but specific types and fusing appropriate for skip bombing attacks. Ammunition belts needed to be checked and rechecked, because a gun jam during a low-level strafing run could mean the difference between survival and death. Fuel tanks needed to be topped off, engines needed to be tested, every system on every aircraft needed to be verified as fully operational. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to turn back because of mechanical issues. Every plane that took off needed to be ready to fight. In briefing rooms, pilots and navigators crowded around crude maps and aerial photographs, studying the reported position and course of the Japanese convoy, calculating intercept courses and timing, discussing tactics and coordination. The commanding officers outlined the plan of attack, explaining how different squadrons would approach from different directions, how the initial waves would strafe the convoy to suppress anti-aircraft fire, how subsequent waves would follow with skip-bombing attacks. They discussed altitudes, speeds, release points, all the technical details that would determine success or failure. But beneath the technical discussion was an awareness of the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. This would be the largest coordinated low-level attack against a heavily defended convoy that Allied forces had yet mounted in the Pacific. The risks were enormous. Ships carried thousands of rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition and had crews trained to use them. Flying at wave-top height meant there was no room for error, no altitude to trade for recovery if something went wrong. Aircraft that were hit had nowhere to go but into the sea. As night fell on March 2nd, the atmosphere on the Allied airfields was electric with tension and anticipation. Some men tried to sleep, knowing they would need every bit of alertness they could muster. Others found sleep impossible and instead sat outside their tents, smoking cigarettes, staring up at the stars, thinking about home and family and all the things they might never see again if tomorrow went badly. Chaplains moved among the crews, offering words of comfort or prayer to those who sought them, respecting the silence of those who did not. Letters were written, hastily scrawled messages to parents, wives, girlfriends, children, folded and left in footlockers with silent instructions to be mailed if the writer did not return. Equipment was checked one final time, survival gear inventoried, pistols loaded, because even if the mission succeeded, there was always the possibility of being shot down and needing to evade capture or survive in hostile territory. Meanwhile, out on the dark waters of the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese convoy continued its steady progress. With the weather clearing, visibility improving, and their destination drawing near, the mood aboard the transports and destroyers was optimistic. Officers dined together, discussing the upcoming disembarkation procedures, the routes inland from Leh to the front lines, the strategic situation they would find upon arrival. Colonel Nakamura joined such a dinner aboard the Kios Maru, sharing a modest meal with fellow officers, speaking of duty and honour and the inevitable victory that awaited once their forces were properly reinforced. None of them had any reason to suspect that disaster was racing toward them across the darkness, that even now air crews were preparing to launch an attack unlike anything they had faced before. The night passed slowly for those who waited, seemed to race by for those who tried to rest, and finally gave way to the grey light of pre-dawn on March 3rd. The moment had arrived. Orders were given, engines roared to life, and one by one the aircraft began to taxi toward runways. The ground trembled as heavy bombers accelerated down dirt strips, straining against gravity, clawing for altitude. The Mitchells were particularly impressive, their noses heavy with guns and armour plating, their bellies laden with bombs, yet still they climbed into the morning sky, forming up into the formations they had practised so many times. Royal Australian Air Force crews climbed into their Beaufighters, sleek twin-engine aircraft that would serve as the tip of the spear. High-flying B-17 flying fortresses, the pride of American strategic bombing doctrine, would play their part as well, attacking from altitude to keep the destroyer escorts dispersed and defensive. But the real killing blow would come from the modified Mitchells screaming in at wave-top height. As the strike force assembled and turned toward the target, the sun began to rise higher, burning away the last of the morning haze, revealing a crystal-clear sky that stretched endlessly in all directions. Visibility was perfect. For the air crews, this was both blessing and curse. They would be able to see their targets clearly, but the targets would also be able to see them coming. In the cockpits of the Mitchells, pilots performed final checks, tested their gun triggers, confirmed that bomb bay doors operated smoothly. Behind them, gunners in dorsal turrets and waist positions checked their own weapons, ensuring that belts of ammunition fed smoothly, that mechanisms worked flawlessly. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone knew that in the next hour some of them would die. But they also knew that if they executed their mission properly, they would strike a blow that could change the course of the campaign in New Guinea. The Japanese convoy steamed on, unaware. Radar operators on the destroyers maintained their routine sweeps, scanning for threats, seeing nothing yet to cause alarm. Lookouts strained their eyes toward the horizon, watching for the telltale specks that would indicate approaching aircraft. Gun crews remained at their stations, ready but not yet engaged, weapons trained skyward but still silent. In the holds of the transports, soldiers went about what routines were possible in such confined circumstances, some eating breakfast, others checking equipment, many simply waiting with the patience that soldiers develop for the hurry-up-and-wait nature of military life. The ships rose and fell gently with the ocean swells, their engines maintaining steady rhythms, their wakes trailing white across the blue sea. To any observer, it would have appeared to be a convoy proceeding with confidence toward its destination, protected and secure. That illusion was about to be shattered in the most violent way imaginable. At 10:15 in the morning, the first alarms began to sound. Radar contacts, multiple bogies, approaching from the direction of New Guinea. The contacts were unusual, however. Instead of the high-altitude formations that Japanese defenders had come to expect, these targets appeared to be flying very low, just above the sea surface. Lookouts confirmed visual sightings shortly after, reporting aircraft approaching at masthead height, coming in fast. The destroyer captains reacted according to their training, ordering their ships to increase speed, to maneuver into optimal defensive positions, to prepare for action. Gun crews swung their weapons toward the incoming threats, fingers tightening on triggers, eyes squinting through sights. The moment of contact was seconds away. The Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters arrived first, coming in like thunderbolts across the wave tops. Their mission was specific and brutal, to suppress the anti-aircraft defences, to kill or scatter the gun crews who would otherwise tear the following Mitchells to pieces. The Beaufighters carried 4 20mm cannons in their noses and additional machine guns in their wings. As they roared across the convoy, these weapons opened up with devastating effect. Explosive shells tore through exposed deck positions, ripping apart gun mountings, shredding the bodies of sailors who had only moments before been confident in their ability to defend their ships. The violence was shocking in its suddenness and intensity. Men who had been standing calmly at their posts 1 second were blown apart the next, their remains scattered across decks that ran slick with blood. Gun positions that had bristled with ready weapons fell silent as their crews died or dove for cover. The psychological effect was immense. The Japanese sailors had expected to fight aircraft coming from above, where they could track the targets, lead them properly with their fire, and bring them down at distance. These aircraft were among them before they fully understood what was happening, moving so fast and so low that conventional defensive fire was nearly impossible. Before the chaos caused by the bow fighters had even begun to settle, the Mitchells arrived. Major Ed Lana's aircraft led the first wave, and what the Japanese sailors saw must have seemed like something from a nightmare made real. These were not the familiar silhouettes of bombers with glass noses and bombardier stations. These were machines whose entire forward fuselage appeared to be solid metal studded with the dark circles of gun muzzles, 8 heavy machine guns all pointed forward like the fangs of some mechanical predator. Lana selected his target, the transport Teiyo Maru, and bored in at full throttle. At a range of 500 yards, still closing at more than 300 miles per hour, he triggered his forward battery. The 8 guns erupted simultaneously, and the effect was cataclysmic. Tracers, every 5th round visible as a glowing streak, connected the aircraft to the ship in lines of fire. But between those visible tracers were 4 times as many bullets that could not be seen, a hail of lead and steel travelling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The forward superstructure of the Teiyo Maru seemed to disintegrate. Glass shattered, metal panels peeled away, wooden structures splintered. Any crew member unfortunate enough to be in the path of that fire simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The 50 caliber rounds tore through human bodies as though they were not even present, passed through light structures without slowing, and continued their paths of destruction. At 300 yards, with the target now looming impossibly large through his windscreen, Lana released his bombs. The weapons fell away from the Mitchell's belly, initially following the aircraft's trajectory. They hit the water travelling at the same speed as the bomber, 300 miles per hour, and the physics of high-speed impact with water took over. The bombs skipped, exactly as planned, bouncing once, then a second time, each skip carrying them closer to the Teiyo Maru's hull. The final skip brought them directly against the ship's side, just at the waterline, and in that instant the delayed action fuses activated. The explosions, occurring right against the hull plating with no water or distance to absorb their force, tore massive holes in the ship's side. Water, driven by the differential between sea pressure and the air-filled spaces inside the vessel, began flooding into the Teiyo Maru's interior at catastrophic rates. Even as Lana pulled his Mitchell up and away, banking hard to clear the target and avoid the fire from other ships in the convoy, sailors aboard the Teiyo Maru were fighting a losing battle against the inrushing sea. The ship immediately took on a list as thousands of tons of water poured into ruptured compartments. Damage control parties tried desperately to shore up bulkheads, to close watertight doors, to somehow contain the flooding, but the damage was too extensive. Within minutes, the list had increased to an angle that made standing difficult. Within 10 minutes, the Teiyo Maru had rolled completely over and begun her final plunge to the bottom. But Lana's attack was only the beginning. Behind him came 11 more Mitchells, each one following the same playbook, each one repeating the deadly sequence of strafing followed by skip bombing. Lieutenant Ralph Deloe selected the Kios Maru, Colonel Nakamura's transport, as his target. The colonel was standing on the bridge wing, still trying to comprehend what had just happened to the Teiyo Maru, when he saw the Mitchell coming straight at him. There was an instant, a frozen moment, when he could see into the cockpit, could make out the shape of the pilot hunched over his controls, and then the nose guns opened fire. The bridge of the Kios Maru exploded in splinters and shrapnel. Windows that had provided visibility seconds before became lethal clouds of glass fragments. Men who had been standing beside Nakamura were cut down, their bodies torn apart by the concentrated fire. The colonel himself was thrown backward by the sheer violence of the impact, slamming against a bulkhead hard enough to crack ribs. Stunned, ears ringing from the incredible noise, bleeding from numerous small cuts, he struggled to regain his feet just in time to feel the entire ship shudder from a massive explosion deep within its hull. Deleu's bomb had struck precisely at the waterline amidships, detonating in or near the engine room, and the effect was catastrophic. The explosion killed everyone in the engineering spaces instantly, vaporized by the blast or crushed by collapsing metal. It ruptured steam lines and superheated steam at hundreds of degrees, and extreme pressure began venting into adjacent compartments, cooking alive anyone trapped in those spaces. It destroyed the ship's power generation, plunging interior spaces into darkness except for the glow of fires that were already beginning to spread. The Chios Maru, which moments before had been a functioning vessel carrying thousands of men toward war, had become a floating coffin. All around the convoy, the same scenes repeated with mechanical efficiency. Mitchell after Mitchell pressed its attack, ignoring the anti-aircraft fire that belatedly began to fill the air, boring into point-blank range before releasing its bombs. The Nojima Maru took 3 direct hits in rapid succession, bombs entering the hull at different points and detonating almost simultaneously. The combined force of the explosions broke the ship's back, the keel fracturing under stress it was never designed to endure, and the Nojima Maru literally split into 2 sections that began sinking independently. The Kembu Maru, carrying aviation fuel among its cargo, erupted into a fireball when a bomb penetrated into the holds where fuel drums were stored. The explosion was so violent that it was felt on ships miles away, and a pillar of flame and smoke rose hundreds of feet into the air. Fragments of the ship, some as large as automobiles, were hurled into the sky by the force of the detonation, falling back to the sea in a deadly rain of twisted metal. The destroyer escorts, designed and equipped to defend against aerial attack, found themselves helpless in the face of tactics they had never anticipated. Their anti-aircraft guns, effective against aircraft at thousands of feet of altitude, could not depress low enough to engage targets coming in at masthead height. The gunners tried desperately to track the incredibly fast-moving Mitchells, swinging their weapons in frantic arcs, but the bombers were past them before fire could be brought to bear. Smaller caliber weapons, machine guns, and light automatic cannons that could theoretically engage low-flying aircraft were swept by the strafing fire from the Mitchells and Beaufighters. Gun crews were killed before they could fire a shot, or were forced to abandon their positions in the face of fire so intense that remaining at their posts meant certain death. One destroyer captain, in an act of either immense courage or complete desperation, attempted to ram a Mitchell that was lining up for an attack run. He ordered his ship to maximum speed and turned directly toward the oncoming bomber, perhaps hoping to at least damage the aircraft badly enough that it would crash or be forced to break off. The American pilot saw the destroyer's bow swinging toward him and realized what was happening. He held his course until the last possible fraction of a second, held it until it seemed certain that collision was inevitable, and then yanked back on his control yoke with all his strength. The Mitchell, straining against the forces of flight, clawed for altitude. The bomber's belly cleared the destroyer's forward mast by less than 10 feet, so close that the tail gunner looking down into the bridge could see the horrified expressions on the faces of the Japanese officers. As the Mitchell passed overhead, the dorsal turret gunner, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, opened fire straight down into the destroyer's superstructure. The stream of 50 caliber rounds punched through the relatively thin deck plating as though it were paper, raking the bridge and everything below it. The captain and most of his bridge crew died instantly, their bodies shredded by the gunfire. With no one alive to countermand the last orders given, the destroyer continued on its collision course, but now without its target, and ran headlong into another Japanese vessel, the 2 ships colliding with a grinding crash that tore open both hulls and sent both vessels listing heavily, aflame and doomed. The attack continued with merciless precision. American pilots had trained for this, had practiced their coordination, and now that training paid dividends written in destruction. High above the chaos, B-17 flying fortresses droned along at 20,000 feet, dropping their bombs from altitude. These attacks were not expected to achieve direct hits. The old problems of accuracy against moving targets remained, but they served a critical purpose in the overall plan. The threat from above forced the Japanese destroyers to maintain formation, to keep their overlapping fields of fire, to watch the skies above them. This divided their attention and prevented them from concentrating solely on the low-level attackers that were doing the real damage. Bombs falling from the B-17s, even when they missed, sent up enormous geysers of water that drenched vessels and added to the general chaos and confusion. The Japanese commanders found themselves in an impossible situation, needing to defend against threats from multiple altitudes and directions simultaneously, and the result was that they defended effectively against none of them. Within an hour of the first attack, the convoy had been reduced to a shambles. Of the 8 transports, 4 were already at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, taking with them thousands of soldiers who had never had a chance to fire a shot in their own defence. The remaining 4 were heavily damaged, listing on fire, or a combination of all 3. The destroyers, which had been supposed to protect the convoy, were themselves burning and sinking. Some had been struck directly by bombs. Others had been riddled by strafing fire that had killed crew members and destroyed vital systems. All of them were marked by the black smoke pouring from damaged sections, the flames visible through ruptured hulls, the debris fields spreading outward as damaged vessels shed pieces of themselves into the sea. As the first wave of attackers withdrew to rearm and refuel, the scene left behind was one of almost incomprehensible devastation. The clear blue waters of the Bismarck Sea were now covered with oil slicks spreading from ruptured fuel tanks, with debris ranging from life preservers to entire sections of ship structure, and with men, hundreds and then thousands of men, struggling in the water. Soldiers who had been packed into the holds of the transports, who had felt the ships shuddering under them from explosions and heard the horrible sounds of tearing metal, had poured out onto Deck S only to find that their ships were sinking beneath them. They had jumped or been blown into the sea, and now they clung to whatever floated, rafts, planks, crates, anything that would keep them above water. The sea temperature was not immediately fatal, but exposure would kill given time. Sharks, attracted by blood and the vibrations of so much activity, began to circle in the water. For the men floating amid the wreckage, the immediate terror of the attack had been replaced by a different kind of horror. The slow realization that rescue might not come, that they might die here in the water, far from home, alone. Colonel Nakamura found himself among those struggling survivors. The Kios Maru had capsized, rolling over with agonizing slowness, giving him just enough time to fight his way out of the sinking wreckage and reach the surface. He broke through into air and light, gasping and choking, his uniform soaked and heavy, pulling him down. He shed his jacket and boots, lightening his burden, and grabbed onto a piece of wood that had once been part of the ship's superstructure. Around him, the surface of the sea was a vision of hell. Bodies floated face down, men who had been killed in the initial attacks or who had drowned in the sinking ships. Others thrashed and called out, begging for help that no one could provide. The cries of the wounded and dying created a chorus of suffering that was almost worse than the sounds of battle had been. Nakamura, trained as a soldier to face death in combat, found himself confronting a different kind of death, slow and inexorable, as he floated amid the ruins of his convoy. And then the aircraft returned. For the Japanese survivors floating in the water, the sound of engines approaching from the distance brought a moment of hope, irrational but powerful, that perhaps rescue was coming. Perhaps their own aircraft had arrived to drive off the attackers and provide cover for rescue operations. That hope died the instant they recognized the silhouettes as more American bombers. The aircraft that returned to the scene were not there to attack ships. There were no ships left worth attacking, but to ensure that the destruction was complete. The orders were clear and cold, no survivors. It was a brutal calculus of war. Every soldier who lived today could be rescued by Japanese forces, could be brought back to fight again at some future date. In a war where every combat-capable soldier mattered, where reinforcements were precious and difficult to replace. Allowing thousands of trained troops to survive even a destroyed convoy was strategically unacceptable. The aircraft came in low, just as they had during the initial attacks, but now their targets were not steel hulls, but men floating in the water. Machine guns opened up, tracers walking across the surface of the sea, bullets churning the water into foam. Men died by the dozens, by the hundreds, cut down by fire from the sky. Some tried to dive beneath the surface, hoping that a few feet of water would provide protection, but the .50 caliber rounds could penetrate quite deeply before losing their lethal velocity. Others simply froze, paralyzed by terror, unable to process what was happening, and died where they floated. A few, perhaps through some combination of luck and the sheer chaos of the situation, survived by hiding beneath debris or by diving and swimming underwater until their lungs burned and they had to surface. Colonel Nakamura, clinging to his piece of flotsam, watched American aircraft wheel overhead like enormous predatory birds. He saw the guns tracking across the water, saw men around him jerking and thrashing as bullets found them, saw the water turning red with blood. He pressed himself as flat as possible against his wooden float, making himself as small a target as he could, and prayed to ancestors and gods with equal fervour. The strafing runs continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably less than one. Pilots who years later would speak of this phase of the battle did so with evident discomfort, even shame. Many had compartmentalized the memory, boxed it away in places they did not examine. They had followed orders. They had done what they were told was necessary. But the images stayed with them, images of men raising their arms in surrender or supplication, of the water erupting around floating clusters of survivors, of the terrible mathematics of war that reduced human beings to targets no different than ships or tanks. Some diaries and letters home from that period, written by aircrew members who participated in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, contained cryptic references to things seen that could not be spoken about, to actions taken that weighed on the soul, to the price paid not just by the enemy but by those who inflicted the destruction. When the final aircraft departed, when the sound of engines faded into the distance and silence returned to the Bismarck Sea, what remained was a scene of utter desolation. The convoy no longer existed. All 8 transports rested on the ocean floor, some in relatively shallow water, others in depth so profound that their wreckage would never be found. 4 of the 8 destroyer escorts had been sunk as well, sent to the bottom by bombs or by damage so severe that they could not be saved. The remaining 4 destroyers, all heavily damaged, were trying to pick up what survivors they could find, but their capacity was limited and thousands of men remained in the water. The oil slicks, spreading across miles of ocean, made the task even more difficult and dangerous. Men coated in fuel oil were hard to spot, and the oil itself was toxic, burning eyes and throats, poisoning those who swallowed it. Of the approximately 7,000 men who had sailed with the convoy, fewer than 1,300 would survive to reach land. Some would be picked up by the destroyers. A few would be rescued by Japanese submarines that arrived in the area days later, though by that time many more had died from exposure, from wounds, from sharks, or from simply giving up hope and slipping beneath the waves. A handful would manage to swim or drift to remote shorelines, there to either die from injuries and starvation or to eventually make contact with Japanese forces. The rest, the vast majority, perished in the waters of the Bismarck Sea, their bodies never recovered, their names eventually inscribed on memorials for the missing, families back in Japan left to mourn men who had simply vanished into the vast Pacific. The news of the disaster reached Japanese headquarters in Rabaul and then Tokyo with the impact of a physical blow. The loss of 8 transports and 4 destroyers was catastrophic in material terms, but the loss of 7,000 troops was even worse. These were not replaceable numbers on a spreadsheet. These were trained soldiers, men who had received months or years of instruction, who had been equipped and prepared for combat, whose experience made them far more valuable than raw recruits. The Japanese military had just lost an entire division's worth of combat power without those men ever reaching the battlefield. The strategic implications were immediately apparent. Without those reinforcements, the garrison at Leh would not be able to hold. Without the ability to safely transport large numbers of troops across contested waters, the entire Japanese position in New Guinea would become untenable. The defeat in the Bismarck Sea was not just a tactical disaster. It was a strategic catastrophe that would cascade through subsequent operations and ultimately contribute to the loss of New Guinea entirely. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Japanese naval officers, who had built their careers on doctrines of surface warfare, who had studied Mahan and believed in the decisive engagement between fleets, were forced to confront a new reality in which their beautiful theories meant nothing against aircraft that could attack with impunity. The word spread quickly through the Japanese military, whispered at first and then spoken more openly, about the flying destroyers, about bombers that came in at wave height breathing fire, about bombs that skipped across the water like stones and tore ships apart at their most vulnerable points. Sailors who had previously regarded aircraft as nuisances, threats that could be managed with proper defensive fire, now looked at the sky with genuine fear. The morale effect rippled outward, affecting not just those directly involved, but every sailor in the Japanese Navy who heard the stories. Confidence, once shaken, is difficult to restore, and the confidence of Japanese naval forces in their ability to protect convoys had been shattered beyond repair. From Tokyo, orders went out that future major troop movements would be conducted only by fast destroyers running at night, avoiding daylight hours when they would be vulnerable to air attack. Even this expedient was recognized as inadequate, merely a way to reduce risk rather than eliminate it, but no better options existed. The age of safely running convoys across contested waters in the Pacific was over, ended in the space of a few hours on March 3, 1943. The battle had demonstrated beyond any possibility of argument that air power, properly applied, was now dominant over sea power, that ships without air cover were simply targets waiting to be destroyed. This lesson, written in blood and oil on the surface of the Bismarck Sea, would inform Japanese strategy for the rest of the war, forcing a defensive posture, an inability to mass forces where they were needed, a slow strangulation of far-flung garrisons that could no longer be supplied or reinforced. For the Allies, the tactical and strategic success of the battle was cause for celebration tempered by the grim recognition of what such victories required. Headlines in American and Australian newspapers proclaimed the great victory, speaking of enemy convoys annihilated and Japanese plans thwarted. The public, desperate for good news after years of defeats and setbacks, embraced the story enthusiastically. But for those who had actually fought the battle, the memory was more complex. They had proven that innovation and courage could overcome even well-defended targets. They had validated months of experimentation and training, shown that the 8-gun nose and skip bombing could work exactly as designed. They had struck a blow that genuinely changed the strategic balance in the Southwest Pacific. But they had also strafed men in the water, had followed orders that required them to kill defeated and defenseless enemies, and that moral weight did not lift simply because the orders had been legal and the strategic justification sound. Wars are won by people willing to do terrible things in service of what they believe is a greater good. The air crews who fought over the Bismarck Sea that day were such people, and they carried the burden of their actions for the rest of their lives. Pappy Gunn, the mechanic turned innovator whose vision had transformed B-25 bombers into flying destroyers, received recognition for his contributions, though official awards and commendations could never adequately capture what he had achieved. His work had quite literally changed how war was waged, had taken an established weapon system and reimagined it so completely that it became something entirely new. The 8-gun nose would become standard on many subsequent Mitchell variants, the aircraft serving in modified form throughout the rest of the Pacific War and even seeing use in other theatres. Skip bombing, once an experimental technique practiced by a handful of squadrons, became doctrine, incorporated into training programs and tactical manuals. Future generations of aviators would learn these methods as standard procedures, perhaps never fully appreciating that they had been invented out of desperation by men who refused to accept that established methods were the only methods. For Colonel Tishi Nakamura, the battle marked the end of his war in a way he had never imagined. He survived his time in the water, was eventually picked up by one of the damaged destroyers, and lived to be repatriated after the war's end. In the years that followed, he would occasionally speak to historians about his experiences, describing the convoy, the attack, the hours floating amid wreckage and bodies, waiting for death that somehow passed him by. His accounts, like those of other survivors, provided valuable details about the Japanese perspective, about what it was like to be on the receiving end of such an overwhelming assault. In those interviews, Nakamura spoke of the battle as a turning point, not just in the war, but in the nature of warfare itself. He described how, watching the Mitchells come in at mast height, firing torrents of lead and releasing bombs that skipped across the waves, he had understood that the world he had known, the world of battleships and naval engagements and traditional military doctrine, had ended. Something new had been born, something faster and more terrible, and the old rules no longer applied. The lessons of the Bismarck Sea spread quickly through Allied military establishments. Factories in the United States increased production of Mitchell bombers and prioritized the manufacture of gunship variants. Ordnance specialists refined skip bombing techniques, developing better fuses and release mechanisms, studying the hydrodynamics of how bombs behaved when striking water at high speed. Training programs incorporated the new tactics, with new pilots practicing low-level attacks until they achieved the same level of proficiency that the original innovators had developed through trial and error. Other aircraft types were examined to see if similar modifications might enhance their effectiveness. The principle that had guided Pappy Gunn, the idea that weapons should be adapted to the mission rather than missions adapted to existing weapons, began to permeate military thinking more broadly. The strategic consequences continued to unfold over subsequent months. Japanese forces in New Guinea, denied the reinforcements they had expected, were gradually pushed back. What had been anticipated as a decisive campaign to secure the island and threaten Australia instead became a costly defeat that bled Japanese strength without achieving any meaningful objectives. The garrison at Lae, which the convoy had been meant to reinforce, fell to Allied forces within months. Other positions throughout New Guinea followed in turn. Each defeat could be traced back in part to the inability to supply and reinforce those positions, an inability that stemmed directly from the demonstrated vulnerability of Japanese shipping to air attack. The Bismarck Sea engagement had not just destroyed one convoy, it had effectively ended Japan's ability to wage offensive operations across the entire theatre. The morale and psychological effects proved equally durable. Japanese sailors, having heard the stories and seen the wreckage of destroyed convoys, developed a fatalism about their chances of survival if assigned to transport duty. This affected everything from unit cohesion to individual willingness to follow orders. Officers found themselves dealing with crews who no longer believed that proper execution of doctrine would protect them, who had seen doctrine proven inadequate against attackers who simply ignored the rules. The carefully cultivated confidence that had characterized Japanese military forces in the early stages of the war eroded, replaced by a more defensive mentality, a focus on survival rather than victory. This shift, subtle but pervasive, degraded combat effectiveness in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. In the broader context of World War II, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea occupies a significant but often underappreciated place in the narrative of the Pacific War. It lacked the scale of Midway, the desperation of Guadalcanal, the symbolic weight of Iwo Jima. But in terms of innovation and the demonstration of new capabilities, it was perhaps unmatched. The engagement proved that medium bombers, aircraft that had been designed for conventional level bombing, could be transformed into ship killers of devastating effectiveness. It validated an entirely new tactical approach that had been developed outside normal channels by individuals willing to experiment and take risks. It showed that technology and tactics could evolve rapidly in response to operational needs, that the pace of innovation in warfare could accelerate dramatically when survival demanded it. The 8-gun nose B-25, flying at wave height, releasing skip bombs at point-blank range, became in many ways symbolic of American industrial and intellectual flexibility. The United States had entered the war with established doctrines and equipment that proved inadequate in various ways. Rather than doggedly insisting that those doctrines were correct and the results simply reflected poor execution, American forces at multiple levels showed willingness to adapt, to experiment, to throw out approaches that did not work and try completely different methods. This flexibility, this pragmatic focus on results over theory, was a competitive advantage that ultimately proved as important as industrial capacity or technological sophistication.